Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar, where IT meets OT. Northrop Grumman shares industrial DataOps best practices from the field, and our webinar today is sponsored by HighByte. I'm Scott Agapol with Smart Industry. This webinar has started. Just a few notes on our webinar today. If you cannot hear me speaking, please check to make sure your computer mute button is turned off. And please log off and log back in if necessary. If you still cannot hear me or have any difficulties, please contact tech support by typing your text message in the questions window on your screen, and our technical experts will assist you. Please also note we recommend disabling any pop-up blocking software or extensions in your browser, as they can cause issues with the webinar player. Additionally, we welcome your questions during today's event. We will answer as many questions as possible during the Q&A session that will follow the panel discussion. But please feel free to send your questions at any time. To do so, simply type your questions into the Ask a Question main presentation window on your screen and hit the Send button. Under the Ask a Question box is an Event Resources section on your screen. Please click on that to receive valuable resources from our sponsor. Also, please be aware that today's session is being recorded and will be available on the Smart Industry website within the next week. You'll be notified by email when the archive is available. Now, I'd like to introduce today's panelists. John Harrington is co-founder and chief product officer at HighByte, our sponsor. And Zach Etier is principal systems architect at Northrop Grumman. And with that, John, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Scott, and nice to talk to everyone. As Scott said, I'm John Harrington. I'm the co-founder and chief product officer at HighByte. My career has been really at the confluence of technology and manufacturing. From working for software companies and technology companies providing technology to manufacturers, as well as spending time at small manufacturers and working with them on adopting new technologies. Today, as I said, I'm the co-founder of HighByte. HighByte is a software company focused on industrial DataOps. And really, we see it as enabling companies to digitally transform at scale. As a company, we were formed in 2018. And we have a number of customers now really span widely across the manufacturing industry. So anything from automotive to consumer goods, food and beverage, pharmaceuticals, metals and mining, of course, aerospace and defense with Northrop Grumman that we're going to speak with today. But really wide adoption. And what we see is companies that are really focused on driving digital transformation, driving Industry 4.0 type of practices into their business. Our solution is really around data, and it's around delivering data to people, to applications, wherever they are. So our platform is called the HighByte Intelligence Hub. First thing you'll notice is through the diagram that you see there, it takes a hub and spoke approach to integrating data systems. So this is a little bit different than your traditional manufacturing Purdue model. In addition to being able to connect to both the OT and IT systems, we're also able to establish data models and manage an abstraction of data so that you can easily consume data from different systems, pull it in, standardize and contextualize that data, and then deliver. It doesn't matter if these systems are producing time series, real-time, historical, transactional data. We're able to merge all of those different data sources together and standardize, contextualize the data to be able to rapidly deploy it and rapidly deliver the use cases that you have that you're trying to use. The solution was really designed for the industrial space. And so it generally runs on premise because much of the data sources for manufacturing companies are still on premise, and we need to collect that data, efficiently process it, deliver it either to on premise or cloud-based data consumers, so that various people within a company can deploy it. And it was really designed for that IT OT merger, and to be able to enable collecting data from many systems, but also be highly configurable in a low code to no code environment. So you don't need to be a software developer in order to get the system up and running. At this point, I think I've told you enough about HighByte. We'd be happy to give you more information at a later date, but I want to turn the webinar over to Zach, who's going to tell us more about his experience.
Hey guys, thanks John. My name is Zach Etier. I work at Northrop Grumman. My background, graduated from Oklahoma State, traditional engineering with a little bit of computer science splashed in there. Been at Northrop Grumman for about 6 years now. My main role is enterprise architect under our enterprise architecture group under Northrop Grumman Corporate. My area of specialty is really digital transformation for the manufacturing floor. So, these new technologies, these new capabilities, how can we deploy them to manufacturing to provide in capability for our end users? Kind of some of my main accomplishments. I'm the lead architect at Northrop Grumman for ITOT, and I've supported numerous deployments of IoT at Northrop Grumman. Just to give you guys a little bit of background about Northrop Grumman, fairly large aerospace and defense company, 90,000 employees across the U.S. In 2019, which is my current metric for financials, we grossed about $33 billion in sales, backlogged upwards of about $64 billion. Northrop Grumman produces a lot of different products. We're in aerospace, we're in mission systems. A lot of it's around aerospace and defense, but we have a lot of different products and a lot of different manufacturing capabilities across the enterprise. To kind of give what that looks like from an organization point of view, we have really 4 main operating sectors. Those sectors kind of group the types of products that our business units make. So we have aeronautics systems, defense systems, mission systems, and space systems. And under each of those operating sectors, you can kind of see there's different business units. So these business units are their own kind of companies. They have their own manufacturing processes, their own devices, their own type of products that they build. So you can see there's quite a lot of different business units across Northrop Grumman, across all the different operating sectors. And what that means for manufacturing is we have about 50 plus manufacturing sites. And a large portion of them are different types of manufacturing. So our largest portion of manufacturing is really coming from that complex assembly. But we also have some sites that are doing discrete and some that are doing kind of batch or process manufacturing. So very heterogeneous environment. And as far as digital maturity, we have some sites that have very little connectivity or they're just getting started today. But we also have some brownfield sites, some sites that already have kind of more of the advanced Industry 4.0 architectures, and they're already doing things like machine learning and utilizing augmented reality and some of these newer technologies. So very large heterogeneous landscape. There's a lot of kind of differences that go into all the different types of manufacturing in Northrop Grumman. And my main role as an enterprise architect is how can we bring these together and start to contextualize some of the data so that we have confidence and we can start doing some analytics across the enterprise. So a lot of challenges with that, and I think we're going to kind of get into that today with some of the discussion. But part of Northrop Grumman is we started what's called a digital transformation office. Kathy Warden, our CEO, has really recognized the value of really investing in digital transformation. So we have a kind of video of what digital transformation means for Northrop, and I think we're going to go ahead and play that video now.
Our world is rapidly changing. The need to become faster, more efficient, more effective has never been so important. At Northrop Grumman, each breakthrough pushes us forward. We understand the importance of critical solutions and why our customers need them. We are using our expertise in engineering and advanced manufacturing to create a digital thread that links solutions from start to finish. Designing integrated digital technologies that are secure, adaptable, and reliable. And the ability to react to the ever-changing environments. We are delivering a new reality, and solving tomorrow's challenges faster than ever before, and showing the world what was once impossible is now possible.
Well, hopefully you guys get a little bit more insight of who I am, my role at Northrop, and what does manufacturing look like at Northrop. At this point, I think we're ready to go ahead and get into the discussion. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Scott.
Thank you, Zach. As Zach said, now let's move into some questions for John and Zach. And we received quite some great questions from attendees in the registration form. Many of you are interested in how to get started with OT-IT integration. And my first question is to Zach. What advice can you offer OT and IT professionals going through a digital transformation that have been operating in silos and are now having to collaborate? Kind of a related question might be, what are key things to consider when starting the OT-IT integration process?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very common kind of question for new companies trying to get started with integration between OT and IT, and something that we're really focused on at Northrop. Really, there's really two main aspects you kind of need to be aware of. One is kind of the cultural side of things. Who are the organizations that are monitoring, governing, sustaining some of these systems that we are trying to integrate with. Part of it's the technical. What are the systems? What are interfaces do they support? What data structure do they use? Kind of some of my suggestions for getting started with that conversation, especially from the cultural side, is really understand the domains and where these technologies are being deployed to. You have to think IT and OT are different domains, and they were really built to serve different purposes. You have to be aware of the differences and some of the things that have gone into the design of that domain to really start understanding what are some of the questions that IT personnel are going to have when I try to reach out to them and start asking about integrating with one of their systems, right? Understanding what kind of questions they might have allows the architect or the company to really think about the use case, what are we actually trying to do, and try to answer some of those questions ahead of time, so that when we're ready to talk with the IT personnel, we kind of have all that information ready for them, and they have a lot more confidence in what we're trying to do. You have to remember, a lot of these IT groups, they get kind of these crazy requests all the time. So anything we can do to really improve the communication between the groups and understand kind of the nuance between integration of these two different domains is really, really important. There's also a lot of technical aspects that need to be considered that you really want to start thinking about. But if you can really establish that collaboration, you can really work through these details. And some of those details include things like the different types of applications, what type of interfaces do they support, what type of data structure, for an integration, for an enterprise architecture, how do we structure that data? What's the data architecture? Do we use kind of a centralized data model, or do we go with kind of a decentralized data model? These are all kind of technical aspects that you're going to want to think about, but until you have that collaboration with the two different domains, it's really hard to get started. So that would be kind of my first suggestion, is really get started with that communication early on.
Okay, our next question would be, how do you design an enterprise architecture for a company with historically independent infrastructures? What technology are you using to achieve this? John, is this approach a common pattern? How are other manufacturers thinking about system architecture?
Yeah, I think thinking about enterprise architecture, and I'd be interested in kind of how Zach has been thinking about it, but I think autonomy at the site level is balanced with leveraging the enterprise level, and the site needs to add value, and all of their systems at the site were really designed and developed for being able to, execute on what they have to do, deliver a product. Ultimately, we're talking about manufacturing. The goal of manufacturing is to build product as efficiently as possible. At the same time, the enterprise is trying to get better visibility into what's going on, to support the sites, and to really drive their business goals of how can we leverage learnings across our enterprise. And so there's really a key dynamic there. So I didn't know, Zach, if you wanted to kind of talk a little bit about it, and then I could jump in after with some of the things that I'm seeing too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's exactly some of the differences between the different domains that I was kind of mentioning in the last kind of comment, right? These different domains are really built to serve different kind of end users, different types of kind of nuance of manufacturing versus traditional IT. So really, when you look at these different domains, they kind of have some commonality. They have some kind of problems that kind of manifest in one domain or the other, but they call them different things. So a lot of what we've done at Northrop Grumman is we have a digital kind of enterprise architect that kind of works between OT and IT. And one of our main roles is to really help facilitate some of that communication, right? So when we're talking about IT and we're talking about scaling and being able to consolidate the number of interfaces and bring in integration, a lot of the IT design patterns, like an enterprise service bus, have been developed to address some of those things, right? And we're starting to see some of those similar kind of problems in traditional OT. OT kind of calls them slightly different. We do things like a data hub, but they're really trying to, at its core, trying to address some of the same problems. So having an enterprise architect in there really allows kind of to help facilitate that communication and kind of level set the two groups to talk about, what are we actually talking about? What are the actual solutions, and kind of get around that communication barrier.
Yeah, it's funny, Zach. I'm sure that you've experienced this. OT traditionally has always been very project centric. We've got this project, we got a new machine, we need to hook it up. We've got a new computer system, we need to hook it up. And so they're not thinking architecture. They're thinking, how do I solve this problem today? Versus IT, they're used to having wide-ranging systems and how do we be more efficient at this? And so I agree, when we can find this architect role that's thinking broader, that's thinking not just how do I solve for today's problems, but how do I solve for the next 5 years problems with an architecture, putting an architecture in place that we can rapidly cookie cutter the needs of the business is where, people and are really focused on moving fast is where we see a lot of innovation and opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, a lot of times, like you said, kind of the specifics of implementations for OT have really been kind of around a single use case, right? Like, hey, I have this problem that I'm trying to address. What's the technology or the solution that helps me solve that? And like you said, when you get to scaling that up, that's when you really encounter some issues, right? When you start to try to leverage that across the enterprise, and there's kind of some nuances or assumptions that solution was built on that really make it hard to scale it out. Things like, it's really hard to maintain long-term, or it's not easily able to be governed by multi-tenants, right? Things like that. And at that point, it's almost too late to have thought about scale, right? When you're already deployed something, it's a lot harder to refactor that and try to, change it to be able to scale up rather than really building from scale from the get-go, right? So a lot of, enterprise architecture is really, how can we build a foundational solution that enables the solution to scale up, to be able to be easily maintained, so that we can expand that for future use and scale it out to different enterprises, right? So totally agree with that point.
Yeah, we've been seeing a lot of companies are adopting cloud. Of course, in some cases, you're either using Gov Cloud or people are just using a data center that's, essentially kind of private cloud or just data center. But they're really driving some separation between their on-prem execution systems and that enterprise view system. And then the key is to be able to put in an abstraction layer between the two. And, some people call it unified namespace, right? That's a common term that we're seeing in our industry. Some people are calling it data hubs. Call it what you will, but a way of letting the systems and the sites be autonomous from executing their business, but then having a way of creating an abstraction layer so that you can commonize the enterprise view and being able to really live in this environment where you just need to be able to let the enterprise view be consistent, let the site view focus on their site, and then be able to kind of work in the middle. And if you can route that and leverage the learnings, we're seeing a ton of value being derived from companies. They're able to deploy, your typical, whether it's predictive asset maintenance, whether it's commonizing your production metrics, they're able to deploy those really quickly across their enterprise.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that key kind of part that you hinted at is really the data architecture, right? There's a lot of problems around how do we structure the data? How do we do design patterns that around data architecture that can really scale out, right? And be able to easily be maintained and things like that. Like you said, a lot of the manufacturing domains, they need that autonomy, right? We're talking about very specialized types of manufacturing, very specialized types of products. And at an enterprise level, I can't come in there and tell them, this is the ideal way to structure your data, right? I need their experts, their data stewards to really know the needs of their domain and what those needs of that data structure are. On the flip side, I still need a way to kind of bring that data together and contextualize that data so that when I'm doing analytics or maybe ML at an enterprise level, I know what the data means. I have high confidence in that data, right? So there's kind of a chicken and egg problem there. They're kind of contrasting different design patterns. One of the things that we've done at Northrop Grumman is kind of really focused on the idea of kind of a centralized data model, a master data model versus really a decentralized data model, right? Allowing the manufacturers or the factories to kind of define those data structures and then having a way to map that to an enterprise ontology. Those are all kind of the data architecture problems that we've been facing. And one of the use cases for why we use something like HighByte Intelligence Hub in our stack, it really gets to that core of the data architecture, right? And kind of the problems around these IT/OT integrations.
Yeah, that's great.
Thank you, gentlemen. Okay, we're ready for our first poll question for those of you in the audience. And here it is. What is the biggest challenge you face with your system architecture? Data access, contextualizing industrial data for IT and line of business, integrating new systems, maintaining current integrations, rising cloud storage and processing costs, normalizing acquired brownfield sites, or you have other challenges. Gentlemen, we'll let a few of the poll questions come in, any poll answers come in here before we discuss. But in your view, experience view, what is the biggest challenge you face in your system architecture?
Yeah, I'll go first. At Northrop Grumman, one of the things I kind of hinted at was digital maturity, right? One of the really challenges at Northrop Grumman is before the DTO came in and tried to structure some type of enterprise architecture, we really had the different businesses develop their own architecture. And because of that, we have a lot of different digital maturity. Some sites have kind of advanced architecture, some sites have nothing. So really understanding when we're trying to develop an enterprise architecture, how do we design something that meets the needs of today for some of these greenfield sites? So, connectivity of the devices, being able to store the data, being able to, analyze the data versus some of our more mature architectures that are already doing things like ML. We have to figure out how can we design something to meet that current need, fit in with the current landscape, but also have a path forward to some of these advanced design patterns, things like, infrastructure as code, containerization, things like that. So kind of a few of those options in that poll are kind of things that kind of go into that. But really, that's what we're really focused on is how do we get, from today to the future and have a path forward to do that.
Yeah, what I've seen, it's funny. I generally think, most of the companies that we're talking to are probably on the front end of technology adoption, or at least the midstream, kind of either early adopters or at least the mid-majority. And all of them have access to data. Like data access was really something that we largely solved as an industry 10 to 15 years ago, I would argue. Of course, there's always some laggards and you get into smaller businesses and they tend to be much more manual. But for the large multinationals, you see that. The challenge that I see is getting usable data. And usable data is in the eyes of the person who's trying to use it, right? It's data that, whether you're in procurement or quality or supply chain, it's getting data that they can use and put their hands around and start to process, or they can land it in their system. So to us, what we hear a lot of is there's lots and lots of data out there. In fact, it's getting expensive in whatever I'm storing it in. but it's hard to use. And how do we get people focused more on doing their job and less on wrangling data around? But yeah, so I don't know what you see from the results, Scott.
We do have some answers already to our first poll question, and it seems overwhelmingly the answer is B, contextualizing industrial data for IT and line of business. 29.1% of respondents so far.
Yeah, that's pretty much in line with, I think, both of us. So perfect.
The second most popular response is data access, response A.
Yep.
The third most popular response is going to be integrating new systems. Is that a little bit surprising? Integrating new systems seems like a large lift for some companies, some manufacturers. Could you guys expound upon that challenge for manufacturers?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of the architectures that we've kind of seen at Northrop Grumman, they, a lot of the vendors that have been used in some of our factories have kind of delivered a kind of a out of the box solution, meaning they might have some hardware that connects to some type of gateway. That gateway talks to their visualization layer, maybe their control layer, right? And so the vendors make it very easy to be able to integrate that hardware with the software. But the problem is we're starting to see a bigger shift to kind of like more of a service or distributed type of architecture, almost kind of like MSA, where now we have kind of all these different types of tools that help in the design lifecycle that we're trying to integrate because they have there's a lot of value with integrating that data to be able to contextualize that data. But the problem is now we have all these different interfaces. We don't know how to manage them. We don't have a way to scale them out. All these different tools expect data in their own format. So we need some type of way to transform data between all these different tools, right? So one of the things that we're really trying to do at Northrop Grumman is kind of take that hub and spoke model, right? One of the things that we're really focused on is being able to scale out. And part of that is how do we make it easy for our sites to be able to integrate new applications with our architecture, right? So we use something like Intelligence Hub to kind of deploy that hub and spoke where we can model all of our data in a central node. It can transform the data. It can kind of do those data ops operations. That way, all of our data is in one place. And now when we want to integrate a new application, we're not spinning up, 3, 4, 5 different interfaces for this new application. We're only getting it to the hub. And once it's to the hub, it's integrated with all these other applications, right? So that's kind of one of the things that we've been seeing and how we've been kind of trying to meet that need to be able to meet those new integration requests that are coming across the enterprise.
Zach, would you agree that a lot of the new systems that people want to use today are really coming out of the IT domain? So, let's be honest. It's systems that Microsoft, that Google, that Amazon, these players that have really developed solutions around, consumers and personal use are now trying to leverage that technology into the industrial space. And the challenge is that comes in from the IT side, but the OT systems traditionally have thought of data differently. You see a lot of time series historians in the OT domain. You see a lot of proprietary protocols and whatnot. In the IT domain, it's just give us the data in a JSON payload, or give us the data in a row-based table, and we can do anything with it. We can turn it into dashboards. We can run AI and ML on it. But there's a little bit of kind of spanning that gap that we're seeing when it comes to your comment, Scott, about new integration, like new systems integrations. The challenge is, I think a lot of those new systems for the OT or, that we're trying to integrate come from that IT side. So being able to do that and do it at scale and do it quickly and efficiently is where the challenges are. And that's where the solution that Zach is talking about with the Data Hub really comes into play.
Yeah, one thing I just want to expand on that too. It's not just like new nodes in the architecture too, like integrating new applications. We're starting to see a lot of new IT-based technology make its way into OT infrastructure as well, right? A good example of this is, containerization has been around for a while. It really helps meet the needs of being able to deploy it out. we're starting to see some of those same needs to be able to, automate the deployment process in the OT domains too, right? So not just about integrating these IT applications, but how can we take some of the technology that's in IT and look at the problems that it was initially designed to address, and how can we understand if that can be used in OT, right? A lot of these technologies they're trying to address the same problems. They might look a little bit different, but if you look at the core problems that they're trying to solve, there's a lot of commonality as well.
Yeah, like we never used to talk about data governance. We never talked about semantic data models or even object programming. We never talked about containers and log files when you were in the OT domain of old. All that stuff, though, was done in the IT domain to be able to scale, right? Because they've always had this scale problem. So it's exciting to start seeing some of this technology being used in the OT domain and being able to really scale things out quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing too, we're starting to see, some of the design patterns that are coming with traditional IT as well are starting to marry more and more some of the OT design patterns as well, right? One of the big things is kind of microservice architecture, these distributed architectures. That's very common with Industry 4.0 architecture. And, a lot of the same issues of interface management or working with different teams that own different parts of the architecture, they're very relatable for OT, right? So there's a lot of kind of compatibility, and there's a lot of different types of technology that can be leveraged on both sides.
Yeah, the other thing that we're seeing is just general DevOps processes, right? CI/CD, and how can we deploy systems? How can we update systems? How can we update changes, manage change, all of that, and leverage your typical systems that IT teams have been using for many years, things like GitHub and whatnot, things like log file managers and everything to be able to efficiently and quickly just scale things out.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if you look at kind of like how a lot of these architectures in the OT domain have kind of been deployed, a lot of them are, you hire some type of sysadmin, he goes, spins up a virtual machine, he installs applications himself, right? And a lot of times that can, even though you might be using the same tools across many factories, because there's a human in the loop, a lot of times you might have different configurations that might manifest problems that become hard to really trace, what are the differences between these different instances. So some of those things like CI/CD are very valuable because it automates some of those deployment processes now, right? So we can ensure that, the architecture is being deployed not only with the same types of nodes, but in the same way repeatedly, right? So it definitely, there's a lot of kind of compatibility with some of those IT technologies in the OT. The important part is just to really understand, what is the nuance of the OT domain, right? There's some differences with how data governance or data structure needs to kind of manifest and meet the needs of the flexibility of the manufacturing domain. But there's a lot of technologies that could be used, maybe just implemented slightly different from traditional IT.
Yep.
I can see that poll question was really on point. Very good discussion. Zach, I have a question for you. What best practices from IT can be applied to OT? We've got a lot of IT, OT crossover intentionally in this webinar. I think that's a great question for Zach.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've kind of already been talking about that question just a little bit with, the
Sure.
invention of CI/CD. And one of the big things that I kind of keeps me up at night is really the data architecture side of things, right? The manufacturing data, you can't have something that's like an explicit schema just because anytime you have a change, you can't do a complete refactor of that schema. You need something that's a little more implicit, a little bit more dynamic to be able to be changed. So one of the things that we're really looking at right now for Northrop Grumman is really how do we define that data architecture that gives the flexibility to the manufacturing, but still brings it and commonizes it back to an enterprise level. So we've been kind of playing around with some of the IT type of design patterns, things like decentralized, data domain data ownership. And part of that goes into that is data governance, having a federated data governance model that pairs with that domain ownership is really, really important. So a lot of these critical kind of design patterns for IT, they're foundational for enabling scale, right? If you don't think about these problems and understand what some of the nuance is, you're going to end up with an architecture that can't be scaled out and it's going to go down some dead ends. So you really want to put some thought into that up front. But yeah, for us, IT best practices is we're really focused on the data architecture and the data governance, because so much of the rest of the architecture is built on top of that data foundation, and driving insight from that data. So
it's funny. That's what, the term that we put around all of that is data ops, or that, that's the term that we've kind of fallen onto as the architecture and the delivery of data efficiently, not the actual use of the data, but the architecture of the delivery systems and the governance and the semantics and all of that. The models is what we, the closest term that we've found in industry is data ops. And that's why we often use the term industrial data ops solution to really address that. But
yeah, absolutely.
When, some people still have that monolithic view, kind of that ERP system, and you keep talking about services oriented. I often say to people, I hope that the ERP system is our last monolithic system, because we really you need a much more agile environment. And when it comes to a lot of the topics that we're talking about, especially in the factory, it's much more of a services oriented architectures are really important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, with that, a lot went into our next question, beginning to hear terms like data ops, microservices, service-oriented architecture, CI/CD processes, and non-invasive data governance. You guys have addressed some of these. Is there any one of those there that we haven't addressed? What do these mean, and why should OT attendees care?
I think they just need to be exposed to it and recognize that more discipline will actually accelerate projects, and more consistency will accelerate projects. And, these things aren't done so that we can slow down projects. They're actually done so that with some consistency, what we're seeing is companies are able to define projects at one site, and then they're able to rapidly deploy it. And really, it's not about deploying projects. It's about getting the value. It's about getting the value, whether it's predictive asset maintenance and a customer develops a solution for predicting when a motor is going to fail, and then they realize that they've got 500 of those across 20 different sites. Well, why don't we use the same approach on all of them? And, or we're trying to measure typical operational metrics like SPC or OEE or things like that. Why don't we do that across all of them so that we can get better visibility and leverage our learnings in one across the site? So it's not that the companies are trying to constrain. It's that they're trying to find ways of deploying primarily to get more value.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing too that we think about is really the flexibility of the architecture too. Like you had mentioned, kind of the OT traditional architecture is really trying to meet a specific use case or a specific type of problem that they're trying to solve. When we're talking about architecting kind of an enterprise solution, we really have to think about digital maturity. A lot of the things that we're trying to address right now are foundational. We're trying to deploy an enterprise architecture that can really enable downstream solutions to have the access and the data and the integrations that they need. But part of that architecture is really understanding digital maturity. And part of digital maturity is realizing that, over time, we're going to get new ideas. And some of those new ideas might require slightly different design patterns. And if we design the architecture to meet a very specific need, it might be very hard to make that pivot from what the current state is to what the future or proposed state is. So one of the things that we really think about is really, how do we build that foundation? So not only can we meet kind of where we are today in some of our use cases, but how can that reduce the amount of refactoring required when we identify new use cases? So one of the things that we do is kind of volatility-based decomposition, where we try to understand where are opportunities for the architecture to, changes to be asked of the architecture, so that we can mitigate that and minimize the amount of refactoring required to the impact of the rest of the architecture. So, being able to build something that can be quickly changed to meet new needs has a lot of value in digital transformation, as we're constantly learning new capabilities, new use cases, and we want to try to include those with what we're building today.
Great. Well, as you guys can see, we've had our second launch poll, poll question number 2 on the screen. for those of you in the audience, the question is, who is driving data ops in your organization? And the possible answers are corporate IT, operational technology, a digital transportation team, executive leadership, or no one. Is the answer typically going to be is A, corporate IT? Does corporate IT drive this?
In terms of what we've seen,
Yes.
It's a good question. I think it depends on the maturity of their data ops and whether they even realize that they have a data ops. Probably corporate IT or digital transformation teams, I think, because that's really the team that is kind of the merger of the IT and the OT. I don't know, Zach, what would you say? Who's kind of driving it at Northrop?
Yeah, Northrop, it's a little bit of everyone. Just because everyone thinks of digital transformation as like a discrete step. You start, you do it, and then you're done, right? Yeah. But in reality, these manufacturing floors have been going through digital transformation, since the beginning, essentially, right? And some of them have solutions and some capabilities, but again, those have really been architected to really solve their needs. And when you're talking about integrating them to an enterprise level and deploying some type of architecture across the enterprise, you really need to think about some of the problems that are kind of not very obvious to just like a basic point solution, right? Things like, the data interfaces, the data structure, some of these things that the data ops is really trying to focus on. So because of that, at Northrop, we have this under the CIO, we have this enterprise architecture group that's really trying to, incorporate some of the solutions that the sites have done or the manufacturing floors has done, but try to refactor them and commonize them to account for some of these things that an enterprise architecture would need to be able to scale up and be easily maintained. So it's a little bit of everyone, but really the data ops section, which is really driving the need for, some of the needs around, these enterprise architectures for the data ops section is really around our CIO. So it's a little bit of everyone, but yeah, at Northrop, it's under the CIO.
I thought our answers to the questions would be number A would be in the lead, but it seems that C, a digital transformation team, is the most popular response. 31.3% of respondents say it's a dedicated digital transformation team, followed by an operational technology team. And then the third most popular response from our attendees, 20.8% is corporate IT.
Makes sense.
We got another question for John. John, what are your thoughts on the Purdue model? How does the Purdue model work in Industry 4.0?
Interesting question, and it's probably one of the widely debated. When I think about the Purdue model, I break it into two sections. There's the layered applications, it starts at the sensor to the PLC, but then it's the SCADA or HMIs to MES to ERP, and that layering of systems. And those were all really defined based on the frequency of how it's used, whether you're doing actual control, whether you're doing execution, so some level of planning and some level of control, kind of set point control, or whether you're doing strictly planning, which is generally considered the ERP layer. And so like those layers, I think, exist for a good reason. But another piece of the Purdue model is how data moves, and generally it moves up and down the stack. And we see that as that has to go away because it's just there's too much data, and data being needed for planning that doesn't need to be used for control, and therefore we need to skip layers and we need to pull data from different layers in order to do different things. So we see the whole data distribution as almost like a different dimension and something that needs to be solved as a hub, right? So you can pull data from different dimensions to address wherever the execution is. But I also think at the application side, what we're seeing is much more of a persona-based application. And I think that's going to continue even more and more. So you may have a individual, whether, let's just say, a controls engineer, maybe doing some planning, some execution, and some direct control, and developing a solution for them, versus a quality assurance engineer who, again, is doing some planning, some execution, some control. And so being able to deliver the data to the persona, because they're really the people, how the data needs to be structured. And instead of thinking it more of an IT basis and thinking it more of who's the consumer of it. And, I think of it, it's going to look more like our smartphones, where you've got lots of apps that are designed for me, versus an ERP system that has lots of functions that are designed for the entire enterprise, but no one really gets exactly what they need. Zach, I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, one of the things that I like about the Purdue model and ISA 95 is really kind of the process that they went through to try to derive the object model and the data flows and things like that, right? Those are the types of activities that we do at Northrop to really define what the domain model is, to understand what the needs of the domain are. Some of the reservations I have are very similar to you with kind of those data flows. How does information flow between the different layers of the architecture, right? ISA 95 or the Purdue model, they define those domains, but there can be differences at the site, right? Especially with these new Industry 4.0 architectures, where not only are some of those data flows slightly different, but there's even new data flows, right, that might not be accounted for in 95 or Purdue that we need to consider. And we need to be able to understand that, and to be able to model that, and to be able to understand what's the data structure that can support those data flows and those new kind of activities, right? So I think it's a really good way. The model itself, the process that they went through to develop that model, I would encourage everyone to go through that for their sites and kind of follow that kind of methodology they did. But I think the results you might get when you perform that at your site might differ slightly, and especially when you're talking about Industry 4.0 architectures. But it's definitely a great starting point.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, we've reached our Q&A portion of the discussion. This webinar has really gone fast. So we're at about 15 minutes until. So we've got some audience seated questions, as well as some from the audience. My first seated question would be, how have you helped customers overcome security concerns with a web-based offerings in the OT space?
Zach, do you have thoughts on that? Being Northrop Grumman, I would think security is always top of mind for you, and is both a something that you live with, a necessary evil, but also a constraint at times.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, let's talk about the need about soft web-based offerings. They really address a really core kind of resource problems for a lot of our companies, right? No longer do we have to worry about the infrastructure and the hosting for a lot of these services, or the versions, right? It needs to be versionless, things like that. The problem is when we get into the InfoSec or the cybersecurity of that data, right? Especially being a defense contractor like Northrop Grumman is, there's a lot of requirements that we get, not only ones that we develop in-house, but also that get leveraged on us through our contracts through the government, right? One of the things that we do at Northrop is we still have some web-based offerings. It's traditionally more, layer 3 and above of an ISA 95 model. When you're talking about the manufacturing operations, down at level 1 and 2, we don't really have a lot of connectivity, and we have a lot of segmentation of our network to prevent access into some of those, safety critical layers of the architecture. When we get into, actual integration of web products at, the higher levels at the enterprise level, where we're actually, analyzing the data, doing metrics and things like that, we do have some integrations out there. They have to go through a pretty rigorous process where we're, understanding and working with the vendor to understand, what data is actually going over that interface. What's the structure? Is it encrypted, right? There's kind of a whole cybersecurity InfoSec kind of analysis that needs to go into that. So it's a lot harder to deal with web-based solutions, but we still have the ability because we still understand the need of it, right? So we still have some, but yeah, it's a lot harder than, internally hosted. Most of our architecture is going to be internally hosted, or through some of our private clouds that we have at Northrop.
Here's another one from our audience. Zach, what tips can you give to keep things standardized through dozens of manufacturing sites that have very different processes and archetypes?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's 100% the main issue, or kind of the problem landscape that we have at Northrop is, again, it's a company of companies, right? So we have a lot of heterogeneous kind of architecture across the Northrop. And again, we can't dictate something because that's just not going to scale, and we don't understand the nuances of every type of manufacturing floor that the experts on that floor have. So we're trying to take kind of a federated or a decentralized approach where we really allow them to kind of structure and model the data that they need. So what we do is we deploy an intelligence hub at the site at the manufacturing level. They can model the data, they can structure the data how they want, they can make sure that the data can be consumed by their apps. At the enterprise level, we do have like an ontology that tries to provide guidance or some type of structure to understand context. So you can kind of think of it as kind of like a data model light, where we have an ontology at the enterprise level. And then the important part is we have relationships between the domain model that's unique to the site up to an enterprise ontology, right? So there's still the relationship. We still have the traceability there, and we can understand the context, but it's not like a top-down approach where we have a single data model that all sites have to conform to, right? We basically map or have a way to publish the manufacturing model and map it to an enterprise ontology. So that gives them the flexibility, but it still gives us some contextualization so that we can do enterprise-wide analytics and metrics. So that's kind of the approach that we've taken. But yeah, when you're talking about heterogeneity and having the need for manufacturing floors to be able to structure the data to meet their needs becomes a very large problem and something that's very critical for enabling scale for the whole enterprise.
Yeah, we've seen. Well, for one thing, with Intelligence Hub, you can deploy multiple hubs, and we've seen people do that. And one hub may be just focused on the data that's needed specifically for enterprise metrics that, that people at the site they own kind of wiring up the data and getting it up, but they have no control over the models. It's very strict. And then they'll deploy a separate hub in some cases. Sometimes they'll put them in the same hub, but in other cases, totally separate hub for their own local usage. And sometimes they'll be publishing into a unified namespace like an MQTT broker. Sometimes they'll be publishing into, say, Influx for their own, and then put like Grafana dashboards on top of that. But gives them just a lot of flexibility to be able to pull data. And of course, they can share data across the different hubs. They can also federate from one to the next. So that sort of flexibility is all available, and it allows you to manage as you see fit. But we definitely see a lot of people saying, look, I need to give my sites some level of control, but I also need to standardize when it's going into these target systems.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing too, I just want to piggyback that federated kind of architecture design pattern. It plays really well for multi-tenant governance, right? When you have different teams that are working at different levels, having those, that hierarchy of different hubs deployed allows, a team to maybe own and manage the site hub, and then an enterprise team manage the enterprise hub, right? So it plays really well to that, and that's kind of how we're using it at Northrop.
Yep.
Here's an outstanding one. Can you describe the thinking around security between OT, IT, and also management of redundancy?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so that's a really, really good question. Part of IT/OT is really kind of two main things. It's really the network or the manufacturing built for purpose network, and kind of the application and data architecture, right? We're kind of doing a lot in the updating our manufacturing networks. A lot of networks are kind of a traditional network that's kind of a VLAN, a hierarchy VLAN approach, right? Where there's a lot of segmentation. And traditionally, you might have an air-gapped OT segment, or maybe a firewall between an OT and an IT, kind of with only a few exceptions to that firewall rule. One of the things that's really hard with that network hierarchy is anytime you want to make a change to that, there's a lot of complexity and there's a lot of configuration that has to be you have to go into the device and update that configuration, right? So it becomes really hard when you have many layers of the network to make changes and to resegment it to meet, the current InfoSec needs. That being said, we do have the requirement to get data up into our WAN environments, right? So there is that connectivity that has to be there. So one of the things that we're looking at is how can we get away from traditional network design that puts a lot of task loading on our network operations teams, where they have to go and constantly make changes and update configurations, more towards kind of an intent-based network. We're looking at some software-defined network options where now we can do things like micro-segmentation. So we don't have to have virtual, subnetting segmentation between OT and IT. We can create identity-based security that enables, data flows under a certain context and things like that. So they're becoming a lot more integrated. There's definitely some needs to segment data out, especially when you're talking about safety critical systems. That being said, there is that need for data. So we have to think about how can we enable the data flows, but still have the security that's in place. And we think a lot of it has to do with kind of that software defined network and being able to change that network and having that identity based access or, micro segmentation. So that's kind of what we're focused on right now. But John, is that kind of similar to what you're seeing across the enterprise, or what's some things that you're seeing, I guess?
Yeah, we're definitely seeing people thinking about the security and integrating across them. And, it actually, I think it goes into the next question, Scott, of is IT and OT integrating them, is it a big risk? And I guess we talk about IT and OT, and there's like different layers of that, right? There's an organization, people, teams. There's also like systems, and then there's data. And I don't think that we're advocating that IT and OT teams just get smashed together and no separation between them. Because from a team standpoint, you need people that are domain experts. Just like within IT, it's not all just one job title. There are people who are focused on security, and people that are focused on network, and people that are focused on application development and application support. So there's lots of different groups there. Similarly, so I don't think that we're focused on integrating the teams, though they need to work well together, because they need to build, collaborations across them in order to recognize the need. They can't be at odds. They need to work together. But the value of integrating the data sets is huge. And the way that I think about it is that OT is really put in place to support the manufacturing floor and develop and deliver the systems for them. IT is really a services organization for the rest of the business, for every other department in the company, to be able to deliver applications and information to them so they can make the best decisions for the company. And so, I think it's critical that the data sets come together, because what we're talking about is leveraging OT type data across the enterprise. Yes, we need to leverage it at a higher rate within the OT domain, but also give it to the person in quality or the person in sustainability who wants to know what is the power consumption of each machine, so that we can accurately measure what products are consuming the most power versus lesser power, or what machines do we need to replace, or someone in supply chain who's trying to understand when do I need to reorder this material or whatnot. So I think you don't want to lose that IT OT persona, but you definitely want to merge the data sets, merge the systems, and enable the free flow of information across them.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I was trying to kind of hint at too is a lot of times, with today's networks, to enable some of those communications, we have to open up a variety of interfaces, right? And it's not really context based. So you might have to open a firewall rule, but that could mean a lot of different use cases for that one firewall rule, right? Now we're starting to see some things with new technologies, things like next generation firewalls that do maybe layer 7 inspection, or software defined networks that allow us to constrain to the type of data flow that we're looking for a specific use case, so we don't have to expose the entire system, right? So it's a way to still enable the data flow, but still make InfoSec happy by not having to expose the in total attack surface, right? So
exactly, you're opening up a hole, if you will, but it's only in one direction. It may only be to flow data out, and it's only from one source to one target. So you have a much more controls than in the past when it was just kind of, let's just open the door and whoever comes and goes, we have no control over. Now you can be extremely discreet, and you can be really discreet when you're using these abstraction platforms where you're specifically only allowing data to go from between these two systems and then let them route it within that domain.
Excellent questions, gentlemen. Thank you, John and Zach. I'm afraid we've run out of time. For those questions we didn't have time to answer, we'll be getting back to you via email. That concludes today's presentation. As I said, before you go, please take our exit survey at the conclusion of this broadcast. And on behalf of Smart Industry, I'd like to thank HighByte for sponsoring today's event, and of course, all of you for joining us. Everyone have a great day.
Yeah, and I'd like to thank you, Zach, for joining us, and Northrop Grumman for allowing you to join us. But this has been great. It's been great to catch up with you. It's been great to hear your thoughts and hear what you're seeing at Northrop, and combine that with some of what we're seeing at HighByte.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for having me.
Yeah,
see you guys.
Thanks, Scott.
Thank you.
We'll talk to you later. Bye.